Hello. During the 30 years of Armenian occupation of Azerbaijan lands, the processes in South Caucasus did not attract the interest of international organizations. It was as if everything was going on as they desired. The 44-day patriotic war, which began in the fall of 2020, woke up the whole world from the deep sleep. Both the UN and the OSCE Minsk group focused all the interests on the region. As Azerbaijan deoccupied its sovereign territories, it was subjected to pressure from a number of Western institutions. Eventually, on September 20, 2023, the anti-terrorist measures successfully implemented by Azerbaijan somehow completed the outstanding provisions of the November 10, 2020 capitulation document signed by Armenia. However, at the moment when peace and security have just been restored in Garabagh, some UN organizations, especially some pro-Armenian European parliamentarians, started expressing their concern about the situation in Garabagh for no reason. We turn to international experts for more detailed interpretation of this issue. Our interviewee is David Parry, a former BBC journalist and political analyst. Hi, David. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being able to converse with us.
It's a great honor, Elna, to be with AZERNEWS and to speak to you. These are wonderful opportunities to search for the truth and look at these issues in detail. Very exciting, and I'm very honored.
Thank you very much. Let me go straight to the question. The first question is, Azerbaijan prevented all provocations attempts by Armenia and its supporting forces. However, Azerbaijan did not change its political position on ensuring peace. The West, especially France, does not seem to have an initiative in this direction. So in your opinion, what could be the best way to make the process of signing peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan come true?
I mean, these are highly complex issues, as we all know. Let me start by unpacking a few things that you said. I don't think it's helpful to talk about the West. I know we do, Americans do, Europeans do. I know we say the West, but I don't think when we're looking at specific global issues, and that's not a contradiction, that's not an oxymoron. This is an issue to do with a particular region with global ramifications. It becomes less helpful to talk about a West, I think, the Western powers. For the simple reason, let's take Europe as an example, very different histories, very different ethnicities, very different countries, all of whom have very, very different views about what's going on and why it's happening in the first place. I mean, the French attitude is uncharacteristically, I would say, belligerent, very, very surprising. They have a very hard view of it all. That's certainly not the British view. I mean, I've got friends in Parliament, in the House of Lords, that can't even speak to each other about the Armenian and Azerbaijani interactions. They can't even talk to each other. It's a time to grow up for us Europeans, I think. It's a time for us to shake free of these old colonial attitudes. They are still there. It's a time to shake free from, I don't know, sort of subtle forms of racism. Dare I say that? I'll be told off, but I've got to. There we are. That really come from us in a Eurocentric perspective to the rest of the world. We've got to shake that off. The French, I think, have a unique interaction, a unique history with the Armenians, which maybe we can explore in a minute as a little more depth. But, if we're dealing with sort of ingrained ethnic identities, there is something called an Armenia, there are Armenian separatists, there was an Armenian separatist state, and we're also dealing with the Azeri sense of self-identity. These things cannot be pushed, they cannot be derailed, I would say. It just takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes mutual respect, which is sadly why I think the French approach in all of this is deeply misguided. I mean, I don't have friends, but I have friends of friends in the Irish Parliament, the Republic's Parliament, who stand up all the time and are denouncing what is going on in the European Parliament itself. They're also European parliamentarians. To say, we've really got to shape up to what we think is an atrocity, what's not an atrocity, where the outrage is, what the cause is, and develop or rediscover a deeply historical sense of interactions. You know, the mysteries of history. How can that happen in Britain? Britain used to be so good at its study of history. The mysteries of history have to return, and we have to be very aware of how these issues developed in the first place, what it means on the ground now, not just amongst public intellectuals like myself, but what it means on the ground. You know, how communities are interacting together, how they're collaborating together or refusing to. You know, we've got to see what history means in practice and remind ourselves at the same time that, you know, none of us really are born irrational. None of us are born as troublemakers. No. We get pushed into those positions by historical circumstance and underhand maneuvers. And I think that's what we're looking at. That's holding back the peace processes, plural. And we've got to start remembering why these interactions, these conflicts occurred in the first place. Overall, I'm very optimistic. You know, my trips to Azerbaijan, my relationship with the Azerbaijani people has always shown me nothing but courtesy, respect, and a great deal of knowledge about the international situation. You know, how can that, you know, just be dismissed? It can't be. Overall, things are good, but we need to be patient in establishing real discussions about problems which are generations old. That would be my take on that question.
Yeah, we still focus on the Western position towards Azerbaijan. So as we have seen, the recent processes have shown how the Western powers are, and they want, by all means, to intrude on the processes in the region, and they've been always biased, as I've said. So especially France is keen to turn the Caucasus into a war zone, as recently the French Minister of Armed Forces, Sébastien Lecornu, has expressed his willingness to sell arms to Armenia. So what means do you think, let's not say Western powers again, but let's say straight away France can use to penetrate the South Caucasus, because we see that they are trying by all means to intrude here and to do whatever they can so to arm Armenia instead of helping the process of peace and negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So what do you think about that? So what means do you think they can use in order to penetrate the South Caucasus, David?
I think you've hit something actually very important. I've noticed myself the rhetoric, the political rhetoric of European countries is changing slightly. It's changing in response to the unfolding events in Nagorno-Karabakh. Is changing and, you know, recoloring who the participants are and who's to blame and who's not to blame and what they're to blame about. I mean, the French position must be colored by the so-called genocide of 1915, when, of course, tens of thousands of Armenians were welcomed into France in the Armenian struggle, as it was known in those days, with the Ottoman Empire. I mean, the French, you know, they always tend to see themselves as a center of reason, you know, and that, I don't know, that must have come as a shock to their internal systems, their culture, you know, all of these ethnic Armenians feeling betrayed, feeling attacked directly by alien and foreign powers, by strange and exotic empires. That must have had a huge influence on the way the French think and react nowadays to those things. I'm very surprised at senior French politicians and their open willingness to arm a particular section of a country. It must come from those historical roots. I can't see any other way of explaining that. You know, the West itself has lost its sense of conscience in many ways at the minute. And again, when I use the word West, I'm talking about Europe. I don't really want to talk about the American milieu at depth, because I'm not an American. But at the same time, I think we can say certain things about where that's wavering at the minute. And dare I suggest the cultural arrogance that's behind that. Certainly dare I say, you know, the rush to arm Armenians, I find shocking and a little surprising. in equal measure, for the simple reason that's not really what they were saying 20 years ago. And, you know, it's this underhand way of reintroducing commerce back into a humanitarian situation. You know, isn't that terrible? Isn't it wicked? All of these people, you know, they're under attack, they're being slaughtered. Let's make a trading deal. You know, but people need to be a little more honest about really what's going on underneath. And certainly, I think French culture, because of the tens of thousands of settlers that went there not too long ago, is coloured in a particular direction. And that's not attacking the French, that's not attacking the Armenians, and it's certainly not attacking the Azerbaijanis. But, you know, that will be a reaction, that will be an outcome to what happened then. But, you know, I think we're looking at trade in disguise more than moral outrage. And I find that shocking, and I find it deleterious to the Western conscience, to the European conscience. I dare to think where we go from here. You know, Rishi Sunak selling depleted weapons of nuclear capacity, you know, depleted nuclear weapons to the Ukrainians. That would never have happened 20 years ago. But now it's a trade deal. You know, it's an opportunity. And you get the rhetoric here, you know, British jobs for British workers. What's that got to do with it? You know, no, the whole thing is sinking. The situation is sinking. The rule of international law appears to be weakening. And we're getting back into this sort of jungle mentality where I'm right and you're wrong simply because I've got more money and I've got more to get out of this situation that you do. Very, very depressing. I hope that answers a bit, Elna, because I find the French's attitude increasingly angry and belligerent. As I say, I think those are the two sources of that, from my point of view: historical contingencies and commerce in disguise.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit the effects of the Western influence inside the region. So it's clear that the desire of the Western forces to create the influence in the Caucasus is also a threat to neighboring Russia and Iran. Even this problem is one of the main factors preventing the opening of the Zangezur corridor, which is vital for the whole extent of the middle corridor, as one of the main segments of that. So what do you think would be the most successful means of curbing the Western influence, including France, of course, in the region?
A little more honest discussion, I think, needs to be held at the international table. You know, these aren't the days of the Crusades. These aren't the days of the Ottomans. These aren't the days of competing religious ideologies. All that's gone. We live in a very, very different world nowadays. And again, what we're looking at, I think, is oil and gas and this incessant need by NATO to undermine the stability of those around its borders. You know, someone made a joke a couple of years ago. Isn't it shocking that all of our enemies, I don't know who we are, all of our enemies are on the borders of NATO? It's a joke because, you know, NATO expands exponentially, and it's making sure there's a problem when it goes up against people who don't share our history or our culture. You know, there's a sense of otherness, I think, going back to the French for a moment, when it comes to Turkic cultures. You know, that's not reason, that's not Western, that's not European. It's this exotic, you know, wild, beautiful, and completely irrational group of cultures, group of peoples that can't be dealt with on a logical level. I mean, you know, that's something, a hangover from the past, a beautiful image belonging to magic carpets and minarets from centuries ago, but not the political realities of nowadays, even if they were ever political realities, which I doubt. You know, so there's a sort of colonial influence here. Right. Plus the fact, of course, we do appear to be fighting a proxy war with Russia, with the Russian Federation, to our disgrace. You know, the sheer amount of weaponry that's being poured into countries that either on the border of Russia or are actual Russia, I mean, parts of Russia are in the South Caucasus. And, you know, those mysterious countries like Georgia that have so many conflicting interests, so incredibly complex to over there and over here. You know, we're looking at basically political pressure in disguise, and as I say, oil and gas and revenues in disguise. The attitude has become destabilize, and they will start to work, in the map, in the frame of reference that we want them to. That is not healthy. That's a new form of warmongering, or rather a recovered form of warmongering. I mean, that was prevalent amongst the Victorians. And that's resurging at the moment. And what we're actually talking about, I think, a political and financial interest in disguise. We're looking at the corporations clothing themselves in pseudo-humanitarian, dress, in pseudo-political attire, when really what they're trying to do is force through their own particular agendas. And that's why they need that type of influence. It's not really, to my view, and I'm sure I'm totally wrong, even about the politics of the region. It's about the commerce of the region. Where will we all be in Europe if the pipelines suddenly shut themselves off? Oil disappears and gas disappears. We will be nowhere. And who is really talking about that through all these internal memos that leak out? It's the corporations. It's not even the politicians. Again, sadly, these aren't the days of Adam Smith and the Enlightenment, where the hand of history is working to sort things out. It's a scramble nowadays in European nations and in America for the type of influence that makes pure and simple trade, and it's disgraceful, and a curse upon us all.
All right. I think the conflicts are not going to be over in the world. We think on the one hand about Caucasus, and on the other hand, we hear a lot of shocking news coming from the Middle East right now. And I want to direct the question a little bit towards the Middle East right now. As we know, there is a very high tensions between Israel and Palestine right now. The tensions between Israel and Palestine, as I said, has started to have certain effects on the surrounding regions, and both economically and politically, of course. And the question is, do you think that the conflict could somehow create any risk for the Caucasus and its surrounding regions or countries?
The tragedy of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is almost so great, I can barely find words to express myself. The extreme right-wing Knesset of Netanyahu isn't helping at all. It's almost as though they've been looking for excuses for some time to make an issue and clear new lands. I mean, how that man sleeps at night, I don't know. I can understand the nefarious reasons and attitudes of the French foreign ministries. I cannot understand what Netanyahu and his ilk are trying to do at the moment. I mean, there was recent footage of young Israelis spitting at Christian nuns, which I haven't got over yet. What are they doing? They're trying to push people further out to get the lands. There are reasons why these things happen. I need to say I'm not anti-Israeli. I've got very good friends living in Jerusalem here and now that I'm extremely worried about. My partner's Iranian, an Iranian Muslim, and I've got very, very good friends across the Muslim world, so I'm not taking sides. I think public intellectuals must stop taking sides. We've got to unravel what is going on. And what is going on, and there's bad on both sides. There are problems on both sides. Hamas is no friend to the Muslim world in many, many ways. And what it's trying to do with its blitzkrieg attitude, it called the other day for jihad across the Muslim world. I noticed that was misreported in the West as across the world. What Hamas appears to have said, and the level of lies, the minute you try and get to a real statement, are nearly out of control. But what it appears to have said, based on the fact a mosque was either being redeveloped or being told to move, a minor mosque somewhere in Palestinian territories. I'm trying to track that down myself at the moment. It was used as an excuse to, right, let's have a jihad, but in Islamic countries. It doesn't appear to have said across the world at all. Now, obviously, if an organization like Hamas calls for such direct action and direct conflict, that will have repercussions. And the danger on the ground, once again, is that people will get the wrong end of the stick. It is the wrong end of the stick that this is some sort of religious conflict. It's us against them. You know, it's Jews against Muslims, it's Muslims against Christians, it's this against that, as opposed to what is actually going on. Excuse me, a land grab by certain sections of the Israeli Knesset who need to keep their own voters very, you know, they need to keep them happy and they need to keep them voting for them to remain in power. And, you know, international finance again, my deep worry is that, yes, of course it will affect the Caucasus. My deep worry is how far it will affect the Caucasus, how far it will affect Azerbaijan. You know, if we're looking at farming families that are on the top of global media, international news, as it unfolds day by day, and they've just got a rough idea of what's going on at the back of their minds, that is going to cause a very different type of reaction to the one at the United Nations, you know, where people are sitting down and discussing things rationally. No, we've got to be very aware and very careful not to take sides as far as that's possible, you know, not to the inhuman level that nobody ever sides with anybody, that's inhuman, but to the level of saying, you know, okay, Hamas is far from saintly, and I can think of a number of mullah friends of mine that would give a good argument now as to why they're not saintly. You know, but you need to remember that is a representative form of government as far as it goes in that part of the world. It represents the wishes of a certain section of Palestinians, and the Palestinians have been treated abysmally for far too long. You know, that was a problem that was going to explode sooner or later, and it's decided to explode now. I mean, the reasons for that actually, I think, are also very complex. A weakened America, you know, America fighting on more than one front at the same time. And it's really, you know, as I say, in reaction to what appears to be an actual on-the-ground problem, some sort of Jewish interference with a local mosque, which the people living in that region found unacceptable. What we must do is keep a clear head in very difficult times. Otherwise, we won't be able to stop the ramifications of that conflict way beyond Israel. And that's what we've got to try and stop at all costs. Remember the modern world we live in. Remember where we've all reached. Remember we're all living on each other's doorsteps nowadays. We talk to each other, unlike the old days. We can speak together. I've got Muslim friends. I've got imams as friends. I've got rabbis as friends. You know, we're not all hiding in our medieval castles telling lies. So when some groups are telling lies, which they are, we've got to start thinking with cool, rational heads, why, who is it, and what are they going to gain? And invariably, we end up on the trail of money. We end up on the trail of vested interest, and we end up on the trail of those that think they're going to benefit very well, thank you, from problems amongst the lower classes, the lower orders in various parts of the world. I'm really sorry to sound so cynical, and I wish it was otherwise. But again, overall, I'm optimistic. If we keep cool, rational heads, there are ways through all of these problems.
David, you mentioned that. So, as regards to friends, also we have so many friends from the Israel and so many friends from the other side, and this is very difficult. And it's very heartbreaking to see how many people, how many civilians are being killed right now. And just for nothing, just for over a conflict and for the interests of global powers. But my concern is right now, let's get back to the topic of the role of international organizations. So this is the concern, especially the UN in the conflict resolution. So the interesting thing is that, why do you think that the various UN organizations that are concerned about the Armenians in Garabagh, as you remember, who are under Azerbaijan's care right now, who are going to be integrated Azerbaijani community, are so indifferent to the death of civilians and children in the Middle East right now? So why are decisive measures are not being taken to end the conflict? That's very interesting.
I see you saved the simplest question for last. You know, where do we begin with all that? I mean, I'll begin with the fact I've actually got friends who work at the UN, a dear friend of mine, Sir Richard Lynn, actually works on some of the advisory committees in the UN itself. And I would say, chatting with him, it makes me very aware that the UN is becoming increasingly a joke or an irrelevancy for large parts of the world. I find that very, very worrying, for the simple reason it's due to internal politics. It's not to do with global politics. We've got to remember how the UN came into being. You know, it wasn't the original organization to look for peace after the Second Great War, but it was the organization that finally settled in its constitution as the arbiter of international law and as the organization that would enforce, as far as it could, international agreements on human rights, humanitarian issues, and so on. I don't think they're indifferent. I think the trouble is that they don't have the power to do what they used to do. Joke might be too strong a word. I mean, if we're looking at certain evangelical Christians in America, you know, whatever became of the Tea Party, you know, the UN is evil because it's not an American evangelical, the end. But American evangelicals have huge power in voting in presidents. You know, therefore, the UN has been fighting this decrease in authority and reputation for bewildering reasons over the last 20 years. I'd say specifically the last 10 years, where, you know, if it's not done in the evangelical American way, it must be satanic. This is, I mean, ludicrous. And they're forgetting again the history. History is everything in these matters. The history that brought it into being in the first place. Also, they've got this attitude at the UN, from my humble understanding, is that they prioritize issues, rather like in the old Kremlin. You know, comrade, what are you going to talk about today? And if the various authorities didn't like the sound of it, it wasn't going in the right direction for the General Council, then it would sink down the list of priorities. I mean, that happens at the UN now. You know, and there are various pressure groups working in the corridors of the UN saying peace will only come provided commerce sorts itself out first. Oil, gas, diamonds, whatever. So again, you know, it's the corporations disguising themselves in various attires to say, if this isn't dealt with first, then we'll never get to the issue of children being murdered, hospitals being bombed. It appears that the Baptist hospital in Jerusalem was bombed yesterday. I've had conflicting accounts given to me. Some people say it was Hamas, where all these rockets blew up at the wrong minute. The BBC was saying yesterday, actually, it was an Israeli attack. Yeah. And that doesn't even mean the Israelis are being untoward. Did they know it was the Baptist hospital? You know, don't assume that the military have this omniscient knowledge about what they're doing. You know, sometimes they don't, and sometimes they miss and get the wrong targets. I don't believe in the malevolence of Israel. I don't believe in the malevolence of most of the Knesset. I am certain there's a certain amount of malevolence on the part of Netanyahu and his cronies. I think that's clear. But, you know, that's not the whole of Israel, and that's certainly not the whole of the Israeli military, which normally works with a great deal of circumspection and rationality because it's trying to preserve the existence of a small state. You know, what worries me is the commercial interests that are determined to take on the disguise, excuse me, of other things to push through their agendas. And then, you know, children, hospitals, refugees get further and further down the list. You know, we will get to them eventually once these things have been decided. You know, and humanity can't be treated that way. More and more resentments arise. And, you know, the situations become intensely toxic while the commercial interests are trying to sort out how to really get their way first. I believe in the UN. I believe in its duty. I believe in its vocation. I believe in its general necessity in the world that we live in. I don't see malevolence. I don't see anything apart from a diminution, a decrease in its power and authority. And shame upon all of us for putting up with that. We should demand that it gets back from national governments the international support that it used to have.
All right. We hope that the conflicts will be over in the world one day, and also like the Garabagh issue that once was a very big issue. Now everything is getting better, but except the foreign forces that are really trying to influence, and they're trying to instead of bringing the peace to the region, they try to be warmongers here. But hopefully, all the dark clouds will dissipate and everything will be fine. And thank you very much, David, for joining us again. And thanks for your time.